Russian Views on UK Military Activity. A 35-minute presentation held at the Joint Services Command Staff College, Allenbrook Lecture Theatre, Shrivenham, on the 7th of June 2006. The speaker is Mr. Keir Giles of BBC Monitoring and the Conflict Studies Research Centre. Mr. Keir Giles.
I'll be talking for about 30 minutes on what the Russian media are saying about the British Armed Forces and the British Army in particular. You'll get the gist of what I'm going to say from the very first Russian newspaper headline writing about the British Army that I'm going to share with you. It says, "Хуже некуда," it just cannot get any worse. For anybody who doesn't know, I will just do a bit of scene setting on why it is that we think we have a good and complete picture of what the Russian media are saying on defense and security topics. As Wayne mentioned, I divide my time between two different organizations, CSRC, which everybody will be very familiar with because it's downstairs in this building, and BBC Monitoring, which in case anybody is less familiar, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes explaining. First of all, please don't be taken in by the BBC part of the title, although it is the same organization as BBC One, World Service, etc. There are a few crucial differences. One of them, for example, being that it's actually on our side. We are financed directly by government, so I come out of not people's license fees, but their tax bills in exactly the same way as you do. And BBC Monitoring watches open source media throughout the world. It has a number of different language teams looking at specific parts of the world. I work in the Russian team over there. And the product that it provides goes to government customers, DIS, wider MOD, FCO, some commercial customers as well. And that global coverage is achieved through a joint effort with what used to be known as FBIS, as you may have heard of it, but is now the Open Source Center, part of the CIA. It really is a global effort, as well as the headquarters of both organizations in Cambridge and just outside Reading and Washington. You have a network of overseas units belonging to both, a number of independent contractors, and a number of remote stations. And as you can see, Russia is pretty well covered. So we're fairly sure that if there is something going on in the Russian media, then we have it covered. I'd also like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the products that BBC Monitoring put out. If you haven't already picked up some information from here about what monitoring can do for you, do please, because as well as the direct translations of what is being reported in the foreign media, there are other products as well. Do please help yourself to the information we've got down here at the front. And if by any strange mischance you haven't already been down to visit CSRC in their new home, we have some Huawei leaflets from CSRC as well. If you watch the British media about the Russian media, you may possibly have got the impression that it is, if not state-owned and dominated, then certainly under very strict censorship. But that is something of a misleading impression, and that's important for reasons we'll come on to later. There is very little in the way of direct state control. In fact, if you're looking at this scheme of ownership of the Russian media here, it is really only that section up there which is under the direct control of the government. However, there is a degree of indirect control which arises through self-censorship and reporting by consensus. People know what they're supposed to report, and more importantly, they know what they're not supposed to report. It would be very unusual, for example, to see any criticism of President Putin in the mainstream media. But, at the same time, there is a wider range of opinion on most topics reflected than you would assume if you read what The Guardian says about the Russian media. So that's particularly the case in press sources, but also in local media as opposed to national media. There is a great deal more out there than the monolithic state media that most people associate with Russia. In fact, there's plenty more where that came from. In addition to the media that you have for the general public, there are specific sources which are intended for the military, the 1.1 million strong military and the half as many, again, other forces that Russia has. There's a whole complete media sector devoted to them. Not only the original and best Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, the main official source of information for Russian servicemen, but also a big wide range of military broadcasting services, BFBS it isn't, and specialist papers, for example, for the military districts. Each one has their own newspaper, and all the specialist journals for trades, and for the thinking part of the army as well, in the very senior ranks, which of course is not always going to be exactly one and the same thing. And then a third sector we need to think about is mainstream media reporting about the military. There is an awful lot of this. Military activities are very much more prominent in general Russian media coverage than we could ever imagine in the UK. We've got here one newspaper title and 3 television programs. Sunday mornings on Russian telly is wall-to-wall army. It is complete BTRs and BNPs and T-80s and Sukhois and MiGs and the occasional submarine if you're lucky. All of this leads me up to the point that the military is very much more to the front of the Russian national consciousness than it is over here. And this has implications that we'll return to at the end. So with all that in mind, what is it that they're actually saying about the British military? There was a very clear pattern to what they were saying up to late 2002, early 2003. The British Army in particular was a role model to be emulated. It was extremely efficient. It was globally capable. It was very highly trained. It was particularly highly trained in junior commanders. It didn't need retraining to re-roll for different situations. And all of these were things which the Russians, or at least some part of the Russian military reformers, thought they ought to emulate for themselves. So in the Russian media, as part of the ongoing debate about Russian military reform, you would often see examples of best practice in foreign armies cited as a possible way for the Russian army to go down, and the British Army featured regularly in those. But that changed very radically in 2003, and especially over the last 18 months. Since then, it's been almost entirely negative coverage of the British Army. There's been no mention at all of it in the ongoing debate about military reform. It's not seen as a role model at all. The morale of the British Army and the moral standards are seen as constantly plummeting. And this is a reflection of how badly things are going in British society as a whole. And crucially, they say, well, actually, the British Army isn't any better than the Russian Army. They're no better than us. Everything you see in quotation marks from now on is going to be directly lifted from one or more reports in the Russian media. Some of these slides of quotes I will be zipping through fairly fast just to illustrate a particular point without dwelling on each individual one. But if something catches your eye and you'd like to spend a little bit more time on it, then do please let me know straight away and we'll stop there and have a look. The first inklings you get in the Russian media perception of the army that all is not well come with deployment to the Gulf in advance of Optelik, where the Russian media picks up on suggestions in the British media, first of all of the dubious legal basis of the operation as a whole, and secondly in the logistics problems that are facing the army. Here's something where they specifically said, well, if they're not sure whether what they're doing is legal, it doesn't help if they haven't got any loo roll at the same time. This and other factors, it said, had a severe impact on exactly how effective the British Army thought it was, and especially on its previous perception that actually it was quite a lot better than everybody else around. This perception faded slightly in the very early days in Basra and in the south of Iraq, where the Russian media did pick up on the differences in operational style between what the British were doing and what the Americans were doing. So they did reflect some of the things that were being said in the British media about how the British Army knew how to do it, as opposed to the Americans. However, come June 2005, that goes very badly wrong. Here we have a report from the official Russian state newspaper, government newspaper, Российская газета, on the reports that were surfacing at that time of beating of looters that were arrested around Camp Breadbasket. And a couple of things here that I'd like to draw your attention to. First of all, there was surprising unanimity across most Russian sources that were reporting this, that this was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the British Army. So they were surprised and shocked that this was happening at the hands of British soldiers. But the conclusion that they had to draw was that the British Army has turned out to be no better than the American or the Iraqi army, which was a big surprise for them. Another headline you've got there, Her Majesty's sadists, and the British have caught up with the Americans. Moving on in time, it didn't get any better with the Basra jailbreak in September 2005. There was, at this point, the longest and most in-depth analysis of what the British Army was up to in Iraq that I've seen between the beginning and the present day. And I'd like to share a few extra comments from this with you. This is from Krasnaya Zvezda, so this could be taken as an authoritative Russian view of what's going on. The storming of the prison demonstrates more about the fatigue and weakness of the British Army than about its strength. Due to the enormous number of military tasks which British troops are fulfilling around the world, there is a real danger that they simply not be able to cope with them. The long, exhausting missions of soldiers to places and zones of military conflicts located at remote distances from their native country, and these missions are becoming more and more frequent, are having a negative effect on the morale of British families. The striving of the present British government, whose military resources and capabilities are far more modest than those of the Americans, not to lag behind its senior partner, looks strange, to put it mildly. It cannot be ruled out that the British Army will simply burst under the pressure. So a very, very different picture from what you had just 2 years earlier. That suggestion that the British were trying very hard not to lag behind the Americans, even though they couldn't really cope with it, comes out in a lot of extra reports as well. There's the quote I've shared with you already. Mindlessly to follow in the wake of Washington's foreign policy. Portrayal of the UK and Blair in particular as Washington's poodle. Of course, it didn't help that at this point George Bush did actually acquire a poodle who could be shown as Tony Blair or indeed as directing British military operations. It gets worse. The video released by the News of the World, a lot of comments coming out in a range of different media here, and there is no longer any of the shock and surprise that it is British soldiers involved in this. They've got used to the concept that actually they're no angels. And they think it's a result of lack of control by the superiors of these soldiers and of innate racism within the British Army. Not something that would ever have been suggested a couple of years before when they're talking about the British Army's global operations. Still in February 2006, we get another turning point when we find that the response by the British authorities to what has been reported being done by their troops is no longer being taken at face value. That powerful anti-propaganda machine that they're mentioning there is specifically the one which is intended to show that these are just isolated incidents and not characteristic of the British Army as a whole. It's no longer by this point being believed. On another topic, in February 2006, we have Corporal Gordon Pritchard, the 100th British serviceman to die in Iraq. This got a lot of attention. Here's a report from a fairly mainstream Russian newspaper, Trud. It's a kind of Russian daily express. And the report says, the 100th won't be the last. British soldiers continuing to die in Iraq. And what they were focusing on here, across the whole range of the Russian media that we saw, was that this had a very severe resonance across the UK. Increased demands for withdrawal, more public opposition to the war, and protests and demonstrations. Now that quote on concealing the real scale of casualties, you will have seen if you've read the official response to the Dispatch's documentary that this is denied. The original source that is quoted for this is in fact The Guardian. All of this is coming back to British media as its original sources. Moving up closer to the present day, you'll be familiar with this individual. And here we see another development in how the Russians are reporting it. Here, for the first time, we get a bit of a divergence from what is actually being reported in British media. I don't recall, although if anybody did see it, please do correct me, any of the British media suggesting that Kendall Smith's court-martial was a kangaroo court for telling the truth, or indeed that his motivations were not personal but for the greater good. And in general, discontent among British officers continuing to rise. So, all of that is in Iraq. What about the knock-on effect back home? If the Russian speakers will forgive me a fairly liberal translation, what you've got here is something along the lines of the Toms have had enough of Iraq, but that is also having a knock-on effect in the UK as well. Again, it's denied that desertions and absences are increasing, but again, that was actually sourced to a British report, this time in the Scotsman newspaper. And many people, they say, preferring to resign rather than be sent back to Iraq. Let's focus on another angle of the Russian coverage as well. I mentioned the papers of the military districts earlier on, so papers which have a very closely defined military audience. The kind of stories which they are picking up from the British media and reporting are more low-level and more specific, but they're all negative. For example, reports that British soldiers don't have very high standards of literacy, that uniform manufacturers are closing down because it's cheaper to make the uniforms in China. The cost of buying your own kit, which is quoted as between £300 and £500 per year for the average soldier, which again is a figure that they've picked up directly from British reporting. "Не стреляй, хуже будет," said one headline. Don't shoot, it'll be the worse for you. So, don't engage the enemy, you'll probably get sued as a result. And finally, my favourite, the curse of the British Army, comes from a Far Eastern military district newspaper. So, is the British Army still being used as a role model? In 2002, it was very clear exactly what they wanted to learn from the British Army. All of these things they saw the British Army doing best, and therefore those reformers in Russia who thought that this was a good thing would cite it again and again. When they're looking for examples of best practice in foreign armies this year, a very different picture emerges. They see Russian officers being tried for shooting civilians in Chechnya, and they look around and think, well, who else does this? It's a very different metric for comparing how you are performing with a foreign army. All of this 2002 stuff has disappeared. Instead, we're now getting direct comparisons between what the Brits are up to and what the Russians are up to. This is the report on the death of Sergeant Stephen Roberts, who you probably recall was shot dead after his body armour was withdrawn. There are a couple of things here which will be of interest. Soldier of the British military contingent killed in Iraq because of an insufficient amount of equipment, described in his diary the demoralization of the troops. The headline, going to war without equipment, or it could even be translated as sent to war without his equipment. And the crucial bit here, бардак случается не только в российской армии. It's not only in the Russian army that you get bardак. And bardак is a little bit tricky to translate because it means anything between a one-off cock-up and total, utter, ongoing, unremitting chaos, which some think is the default state for the Russian army, but are not quite so happy when it's applied to the British army. And where is it that you see these parallels between the Russians and the British highlighted most clearly? It is in ongoing reporting of the deaths of junior soldiers at Princess Royal Barracks, Didcot. Again, they pick up the reports from the British media and they reflect them. Every time this surfaces in some new development in the British media, it is reflected in the Russian. But the key thing here is the terminology that they're using to describe what is going on. Those two phrases, «неуставные отношения» and «дедовщина», which are the phrases used to describe what happens in the Russian army, the absolute and uncontrolled tyranny of senior conscripts over the juniors, up to and including torture and murder, which is not exactly what most people would suggest is happening at Didcot. But the equivalence is being drawn in the Russian media. They're saying, look, they are no better than us. Why should we improve if foreign armies are just the same? Another topic which gets a lot of attention in the Russian media is the crisis in recruitment, and in particular the number of Commonwealth soldiers now serving in the British Army because of this embarrassing disinclination of the British to serve their own country. In Krasnaya Zvezda, in the official Russian army newspaper, the update's not regular, but it does appear at least once a month, a report on how badly the British Army is doing at actually bringing in any new soldiers. And the one which particularly got their attention was the promise of bounties for introducing new soldiers, which I see has now gone up to £1,300 if they get through Phase 2 infantry training. A lot of attention it got. Here's from a fairly sober newspaper explaining the reason behind it, namely that the British Army is now at its smallest since 1907 and they just cannot get any more soldiers. Alternatively, you could take the tabloid view. Here's from Komsomolskaya Pravda, tabloid newspaper. Hand over your mate to the army and you will get a wad of cash. It did get a lot of attention. So all in all, the picture is pretty grim. I did, while putting this together, put quite a lot of effort into trying to find any piece of news which could conceivably be considered good reporting on the British Army in the Russian media of any kind. I found one. Unfortunately, it turned out where the Russian search engine had taken me was the news section of a colourful and enthusiastic website designed exclusively for Russian gay men, where they'd clearly looked at the original publicity photograph that accompanied this story of the glum-looking squaddy holding up his new keks, decided it really wouldn't do, and they would spice it up a bit with some photography of their own. New undies will raise the fighting spirit of the British Army. Now, I hope you forgive me for not actually showing you the whole article here. I'm sure you get the picture. And if anybody is monitoring CSRC's internet usage, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. On the other hand, it's a completely different picture if you're talking about the Royal Navy. For a number of different reasons, they always get a good press. Chief among these reasons, as far as I can tell, is that the Navy comes into direct contact with both the Russian military and the Russian media, partly as a result of ship visits, which happen on a very regular basis and are reported nationally as well as locally, and it's always nice to pick up a medal or two if you can while you're at it. Partly as a result of a greater shared history between the Royal Navy and the Soviet and Russian Navy than the Army has ever come into contact. The white berets that you see around that gentleman in naval uniform there are on the heads of Arctic convoy veterans, for example. And in addition, there is a tradition, a consensus of reporting very good use of high technology by the Royal Navy. This is something which they are still attempting to emulate even after all positive reporting of the British Army has disappeared. And this came to the fore in August of last year when the AS-28 submersible, the Pris submersible, needed some Royal Navy help to bail them out. There was universal positive reporting of the fact that the Royal Navy not only had the high technology but knew how to apply it in cooperation with other services and with civilian agencies as well. So the question was asked, well, why can't Russia do that? We've got all the kit, why can't we actually employ it? Naturally, the local commander in Kamchatka was at pains to point out that actually, yes, we can. We would have got around to it eventually if the British hadn't turned up, but nobody seems to have paid him a great deal of notice. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to make any difference at all to what they're saying about the British Army. But still, yet more tea and medals all round for the Navy can't really hurt. So, if provided with good news about the British forces, it does appear that they are not averse to printing it. There's both what they see of the Royal Navy and there are interviews that appear with British military figures. This is Major General Peter Williams, former head of the NATO military liaison mission in Moscow, whose job primarily obviously was plugging NATO, but did try to get a good mention in for the British Army whenever he could get away with it, and did appear fairly regularly in the media doing so. A little bit more up to date, here is Air Commodore Andy Verdon, current British Defence Attaché in Moscow, interviewed in Krasnaya Zvezda early this year. Andy is married and enjoys sailing and scuba diving and playing the banjo. Not all simultaneously, we presume. He did give a very good press for both the Royal Navy and the RAF, but curiously omitted to do anything to correct the impression of the Army at all. The penultimate question I'd like to leave you with is, are they doing it deliberately? Is it actually as a result of government policy, stated or tacit, that all of this negative publicity about the British Army is appearing? I think it's not. And I'll explain the reasons why. First of all, if we look at what they're saying about the Army, it is all sourced to the British media, and with a very few exceptions, it is sourced directly, and there don't appear to be very many exaggerations, let alone direct fabrications. They're not making any of this stuff up. They are actually referencing it back to what is being said in the British media. In addition, there are some things which are not appearing. There are some stories available which would reflect very badly on the British forces but are not being picked up. If we take the most recent example, the whole scandal kicked up by the British media about the lack of explosive suppressant foam in Hercules fuel tanks does not appear to have had a mention at all. Going back a little bit further, deaths of 6 Royal Military Police in Magyar in 2003, again, no mention at all. If there was some kind of explicit or tacit policy to show the British media in a bad light, you might assume that they would be looking out for these things and picking them up when they appeared. Next, thinking back to the range of different media that I talked about right at the beginning, there is a consistency across the whole picture. The independent media included. You would have thought that they would resist any attempts to steer them in a particular direction of reporting in a particular way, but there is this consistency. And this is borne out by a conversation we had last week with a visitor to CSRC who is actually a Russian media editor, bearing out some of the themes that we've talked about now. No, there doesn't appear to be any encouragement from the state. And finally, given good news, for example, the interviews with British military figures, there doesn't seem to be any resistance to printing it. What about on the flip side? What about the Navy? Well, when they come into direct contact with them, there is no hesitation at all in giving them puff pieces, both in the local media, in the ports where they arrive, and national coverage. And finally, and crucially as far as I can tell, in August 2005, the Royal Navy did get this ringing and very public, strong endorsement from President Putin saying that they are a good thing. And if anybody was under the impression that they should be reporting negatively about the British forces before that, they certainly won't be afterwards. And so, final question, does any of it actually matter? Over and above the vanity factor that nobody likes to see negative things said about themselves, even if there is a kernel of truth, is it of any importance that the Russian media have this negative picture of what's going on in the British Army? I would suggest that yes, it is. Mostly, but not entirely, for the reason that I spoke of earlier, that the perception of the British Army will be entirely tied up with the perception of British society as a whole. They will see the Army as reflecting what is going on in British society. And on that topic, I'd like to share with you the direct quote from a Russian evening news presenter reporting on the closure of the TVR sports car plant in Blackpool last April, which illustrates it very nicely. It made the main evening news, and the presenter says, "Another established fundamental institution in Great Britain is crumbling before our eyes." So, this picture of the British Army being a spent force both creates and reinforces the impression that anybody in Russia who reads the media, be they in the government or in the army or part of general public, is getting of the UK. More to the point, could it be that this is actually reflected in a number of other countries as well? We keep a very close eye on what the Russian media are saying. We no longer keep such a close eye on what our new allies, for example, in Eastern Europe are saying. Is it possible that actually they're saying very much the same, only we haven't quite figured it out yet? Thirdly, is it important that attempts at bringing the Russian army into the 21st century, especially in the field of interpersonal relations, continue without any obvious input from the British military for military and security sector reform? Does it matter that we don't seem to be influencing them at all anymore in public debate? But, as I mentioned on the last slide, I do think that this is not through official policy, it is more by default. They are doing this not because they want to, because they are simply reflecting what is being shown in the British media. And therefore, I would submit that there is little to be lost and a great deal to be gained from any efforts in engaging directly with either the Russian military or the Russian media in an attempt to try to counter this picture.
Mr. Giles was asked the following 9 questions. Question 1. In view of the British perception of Russia's military record, particularly with respect to Chechnya, to what extent is it a case of them saying, "Who are you to preach to us?" and throwing it back in our face?
I don't think it's got to that yet. I think that they are still at the stage of slight surprise that actually the British Army isn't all it was cracked up to be. So the tone of the reporting, especially in the early days, was, as I mentioned, shock and surprise that actually things aren't as great as was thought. But now it's still more to the point, not of schadenfreude, but of just pointing out, well, look, they're not actually any better than us. So the subtext is, why should we try? I don't think they've got to the stage of explicitly pointing the finger and linking that to a statement, how dare the West preach to us on how to run our army.
Question 2. Many Russian movies reflect the general Russian attitude to war, that war is hell and atrocities will happen. How far is the temporary shock that things aren't different in Iraq feeding into the general Russian consciousness?
It's interesting the different ways you can take this sudden resurgence of all of the war movies justifying Chechnya. I think we heard it mentioned that this was like a deer hunter reaction in America to the Vietnam War. The angle that I'd seen them coming at it from was actually war is heroic and the Russians are good guys, whatever happens. So yes, in the part of that they do have a very much more relaxed attitude to what we might possibly term atrocities in war fighting. Again, I don't think that that is being explicitly stated yet with regard to what the British Army or indeed the Americans are up to over there. They are not yet drawing the connection in any openly stated form. But it may only be a matter of time before, as you said, it gets thrown back in our faces.
Question 3. One of the biggest stories to hit the UK media last year was the award of the Victoria Cross, and yet that wasn't reported at all in the Russian press. Doesn't that suggest some form of intervention or censorship?
It's a good point, yes, Johnson Bahari. You're quite right, I didn't see a mention of that. On the other hand, what we don't see at all ever is any ongoing reports of general war fighting going on in southern Iraq at all. It'd be interesting to look at and try to find out why exactly that didn't make a splash. I'm glad you mentioned that because what we didn't have previously was an example of something which could be called good news but seems to have been completely ignored. I will take that away and look at it, and thanks for bringing it up, because it will be interesting to see if it was deliberately ignored, and if so, how and in what way.
Question 4. What is the prevalence of war reporting as opposed to other news and domestic politics?
It is nearly always domestic politics unless there is a big story breaking as a result of Iraq. Obviously, the majority of what we're quoting here comes from the press because it is a great deal easier to capture after the event than television reporting. But you do have in there a leavening of on-the-spot, at-the-time television reporting, which seems to follow the same pattern and same proportion. They don't seem to be too bothered about it unless there is something particular to report, and even then it doesn't appear that there is an axe to grind. It is mostly straight reporting with no commentary, analysis, or exaggeration. But it is a good point that you brought up, so I shall be looking at that further.
Question 5. Would you agree that what appears in the Russian media is a direct reflection of what the UK media publish?
Yes, that's exactly correct. The problem lies, I think, not with the Russians at all, but with what they are being provided with by the left-wing British media. There are two problems there. First is the lack of understanding of what is going on the part of the people who are actually providing the news to the general public. And the second is that in certain sectors of the media, all of their training will have conditioned them implicitly to see the military as the enemy, which doesn't help at all. The problem arises wherever the activities of the military of any side is being shown through the distorting lens of the British media.
Question 6. Could you say something about the balance between opinion pieces and general news reporting? Is there a disproportionate coverage in the Russian media of British military activities vis-à-vis non-British activity, military or otherwise?
On the first question, it is very, very heavily weighted towards straight factual reporting. There is hardly any opinion or analysis. In fact, the long piece that I read out to you then, the longer quotes, that was pretty much the only attempt that I've come across at painting a broader picture without actually quoting directly news reports. It is mostly just picking up agency reports, BBC News reports, quoting stuff direct from newspapers. On the second point, yes, you could probably say that there is a greater proportion of reporting about military affairs from Britain than you would normally expect. But I think that is not necessarily in itself of any great significance because of the point I mentioned at the beginning that the military does play a much greater part in the Russian media and in the Russian national consciousness than it does over here. You would never ever see that weight of reporting and coverage of the military in the UK media. It could never happen. But in Russia it is extremely prominent, not only their own forces but also what other people are up to. So I think there's not too much that needs to be read into that.
Question 7. Did you come across much coverage of the former Soviet states that are now members of NATO and the EU, and how they've modernised and transformed their armed forces?
There is a certain amount of it. It is mostly, again, straight reporting and mostly in the military press. There, again, doesn't seem to be a great deal of comment or analysis going on, but they will report on it.
Question 8. When the Russian media covered the start of the Iraq War, they were of the opinion that it was going to be a long drawn-out quagmire like Vietnam, and there was a sense of shock as to how quick the conventional campaign was. Why do you think they had such a misperception about the campaign?
I think there it's possible that we're touching on one of the few instances where the media have in fact been guided towards a particular portrayal of how things are going to happen. Again, referring back to the conversation we had in CSRC with Alexander Goitz last week, he was pointing out that there is an interest in certain quarters in failure by the USA in Iraq, and so if you can predispose your readership to expect that failure is going to occur, you could plausibly state that would be encouraged by whoever it is that slips quiet suggestions to media editors. It was predominantly on the main TV channels, what you could very loosely call the state media, and there wasn't quite so much of that in independent reporting where they were saying, no, look, actually, we don't think that's how it's going to work. But you're absolutely right about the sense of shock, and that has given rise to quite a lot of debate afterwards saying, look what happens when a 21st century army attacks a mid-20th century one, to quote one think piece about where the Russian army should go next.
Question 9. With reference to open source intelligence, is the Russian media ever used for disinformation by the Russian authorities or organised crime groups?
Yes, there are going to be two very different sectors of the media for each of those topics. I'm not sure you could call it disinformation, but it would probably be fair to call it state propaganda, which does come across in the two main state-controlled TV channels, which do toe the line very clearly. Clear examples of where that comes out of, for example, the regular gas disputes with Ukraine, Belarus, etc. Every time that's coming up, you can tell by what is being reported on the state television channels. As for feeding the media by organised crime groups, I'm not so sure that happens for the reason, I think, that by the time organised crime groups gain control of particular media outlets, and if we think back to that slide I showed you at the beginning, the scheme of ownership of the Russian media, there are quite a few patches there that you could say, yes, this group of media emerged from organised crime funding. By the time they've actually got to that stage, they are no longer considered criminal. They have, as I say in Russian, come in out of the shadows, and they have legitimized themselves into corporations. So it may be a slightly grey line between exactly how they're manipulating the media when they are engaged in criminal activities and how they're just trying to play off the media against their competitors. But I think you probably couldn't say that there is any direct influence by organised crime as such on what's coming out in the media.
Mr. Keir Giles can be contacted by email at Keir, spelt Keir, Giles, spelt Giles, @gmail.com.